this is Cuddles and welcome back to Tropico Zoo. In this episode, we're hoping to get ourselves some animals from the trade centre. But before we establish our first enclosure, I just want to put down some placeholders up next to the staffing area, because eventually we will need to make this look a little bit prettier and disguise these buildings. And before I place down my first enclosure, I'm going to need a little bit of space established so that we can actually put a few bits and pieces around it once we get to that point in time. So first of all, I'm going to use one of the barriers, because the log roll fencing is actually quite handy. You don't have to use it to contain animals. You can use it to make things look pretty. So here we go. I know this doesn't quite meet up and my OCD is going to be just a little bit triggered by that, but that's not a permanent barrier. It's not going to stay there forever in time. I also have a desire to normally have like a staff only sign with a little bit of an archway as the start of all of my staff only paths. Just establishes an area where you're telling people, well, they can't go. I mean, we know that, the computer won't allow them to go there. Well, that's actual rubbish if anyone played the beta. But anyway, so again, I don't have the building materials that I want quite yet for this archway. But I want to just establish something so that A, it's a nice reminder for when I come back to it. But B, it puts the spacing there correct. So I end up just popping down two very basic arches. And I can see there that I've already placed the fence in the wrong place. But it gives me a reminder later on in order that I can now expand that out. Also, I'm not now going to place my new enclosure on top of it. Let's just have a quick check what Emmett's up to. He's doing well. Before we build our first enclosure, we actually need to establish who's going to live in it. So it's time to enter the dreaded trade centre. Actually, it's not dreaded anymore. They have done a ton of work on this trade centre since beta. I'm loving the filtering system. I am enjoying the fact that you can now dictate how much you want to spend. We did have the search by cash and search by conservation points in beta, but now the fact that you can limit how much you want to spend is fantastic. Now, the first thing I always do is just see what's available for cash, just in case you can get yourself a nice cheap bargain. But as you can see, when we're playing, there wasn't actually very much available. So I know I'm going to have to use some of my very precious conservation points to get my first couple of animals. Already, the game has been live for 24 hours before I'm playing this. And there are tons of animals available. And a lot of them are the startup animals. There are pages of African wild dogs. Now you want to think about what's the first animal you want to put in your zoo. And for me, it's got to be something eye-catching, but it's also got to be something relatively small and very simple to use. And also, I'm not being funny, but cheap. So what I'm going to do for myself is I'm going to filter by species, and I'm going to just click on a few of the species that I think I might like to start out with. I also want ones that weren't in the beta, because they are new and fresh for me to play with. Now, I know I chose the bed's tapir there as a little look at, but that's because I also know it's dead easy and quick to start with. And it was the first animal that I actually placed in my beta zoo. Once I've actually finally got this filtered down to what I think I might want, it cuts you down to just a couple of pages. And then you want to establish what you can realistically afford. Now, immediately the bed's tapir, there's loads of them available because people know they're nice and easy. And I'm thinking, I fancy a bit of a challenge. Now, what strikes me and what gets me excited is there's two little red pandas there. And I think they look cheeky and I think they look fun. Now, genetics is important, but genetics at the start of the zoo, you can't get gold star animals. So long as they've got a relatively okay fertile gene, start out with them. And we do. We purchase them. And guess what? There was no problem in purchasing. It went straight through. I was chuffed. They have done some really good work on this marketplace. I was delighted. And I own my first two animals, and they're red pandas. This is where the game gets interesting. In comparison to beta, any animal that you now bring into your zoo, you must place into quarantine, because most of them are disease riddled, and popping them into quarantine just allows that to be treated and prevents it from spreading to the rest of your zoo, which once you've established a big zoo, and especially if you're in franchise and you've not researched all the vet stuff, it could actually be dangerous and break your zoo completely. So I popped both my pandas into quarantine, and I now know it takes a few minutes for them to come out of quarantine and they'll be all sorted. Next thing I do is I open up Zoopedia because I want to know what kind of fencing do I need for these guys and what kind of habitat do they need. I mean, I didn't check all of that before I purchased them, but I purchased them because I like them. I then want to see whether I can grow the group size, whether we need to make a big enclosure or a smaller enclosure that just the two of them are going to live in, and I'll gradually extend the family out. So Zoopedia is crucial. Check it for every animal that you bring into your zoo. So it's time to find out what Emmett's been up to, and he is researching away like a beast, so I'm quite happy with him. We also need to spend a little bit of money now, unfortunately, on some new staff. So we welcome to our zoo Athena, our new vet, and also Janice, who's going to be eventually the keeper of our 2 red pandas. We need those in order to start the quarantine process, but you will notice I'm paused at the moment because I'm not spending money when I'm paused, and that makes me happy. Time to think about what we're going to use to build our first enclosure. Now, we are not an expensive, money-ridden zoo, so we need to be a bit cheap. And I'm actually going to go for the corrugated metal fencing. Most of the walls of your enclosures are actually hidden from guests, so they're not going to see that because at the front we're going to have some glass and they'll be able to see in through that. So although I like to think about it for a minute, that's what I'm going to go with. I'm leaving myself loads of space so I can do some decorative work just down by the entrance to the zoo path, because I regretted that in beta and I didn't leave it there. And I'm very sorry, but I am not the world's best and smoothest at using this tool yet. I will get there, I get quicker, but I've left it on the same short length that I was using to finish off the other bit, so it takes me a little bit of a while. I also get frustrated because I don't scroll out enough, and I really should do, because when you scroll out you can actually see the shape of your whole enclosure, but when I do I then get confused and I have to restart again. This happens to everybody until you're a pro with this tool. Don't worry about it, and you can always undo what you have done. Also, it seems to spring off in random locations and directions, but that's all cool with me. So I slowly build myself what looks to be yet another Cuddles special square enclosure. What's going through my brain as I do this is supposed to be my very first cheap enclosure in order that we can get some guests in and some animals established in our zoo, so that we can get some cash coming in. This will not be the final enclosure that sits here, but it will be here for a little bit of time. So let's keep it to a regular shape and just ensure that we can just establish ourselves. Now, top tip here, if you don't have quite the right length, you can kind of just tag it onto the post, but you know what, that's still misshapen and it's going to annoy me. But you know what, let's just fix it. Okay, you can always edit. It won't take long to fix up, and I managed to do it. Little bit of fiddling and it looks fine. Apologies to those who get triggered by my finagling, but we get there eventually, but you don't have to watch the whole of that. Having skipped through that chaos, now we need to ensure that our visitors and our guests can actually see our red pandas, because last time I checked, corrugated metal isn't see-through. So all I'm doing at this point is swapping the whole front to glass. Now that's not ideal, and I'm sure I'm going to change that at some point so it's windowed, but I'm quite happy. We've got our first enclosure established. So what actually turns it into an animal enclosure? It doesn't become alive, able to accept animals until we've placed a keeper's gate. So what we're going to want to do is place that as near as possible to our keeper's hut and as far away from the guests. So we're going to plop that up our path and it's easily accessible for them to come in and out. Now, I also realised that I've actually forgotten the building because my vet can't do any research. Without the research centre, Athena, my new vet, cannot actually look into the diseases and also the improvements for the animals that we're going to have in our zoo. So it's also a really important building. Takes me some while just to plot this one down because, to be honest with you, I'd got everything set up and ready to go. So we've done in this episode, our first enclosure is ready for our red pandas. We've got our pandas sat in quarantine, excited, waiting for their new enclosure. We've added in our research centre, which means that Athena can start looking into all the terrible diseases that might come to my zoo. Next episode, we're moving our pandas in. Thanks for watching.